stagnation period of decline, higher taxes on the wealthy and preserve the limited social benefits. The outcome of the deficit commission is probably going to be the opposite. Either they'll reach an agreement, which will be the opposite of what the public wants, or else it goes into a kind of automatic procedure, which is going to have those effects. Actually, that's something that has to be done very quickly. Deficit Commission's going to come up with its decision in a couple of weeks. The Occupy movements could provide a mass base for trying to avert what amounts to a dagger pointed at the heart of the country. It could have very negative effects. It's an immediate task. Well, without going on in the details, what's being played out for the last 30 years is actually a kind of a nightmare that was anticipated by the classical economists. If you take, say, Adam Smith, bother to read Wealth of Nations, he considered the possibility that merchants and manufacturers in England might decide to do their business abroad, invest abroad and import from abroad. He said they would profit, but England would be harmed. However, he went on to say that they would prefer to, the merchants, manufacturers would prefer to operate in their own country, what's sometimes called a home bias. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be saved the ravages of what's now called neoliberal globalization. That's a pretty hard passage to miss in his classic Wealth of Nations. That's the only occurrence of the phrase invisible hand. Maybe England would be saved from neoliberal globalization by an invisible hand. The other great classical economist, David Ricardo, recognized the same thing and hoped that it wouldn't happen, kind of sentimental hope. And it didn't for a long time, but now it's happening. The last 30 years, that's exactly what's been underway. For the general population, the 99% in the imagery of the Occupy movement, it's been pretty harsh, and it could get worse. This could be a period of irreversible decline. For the 1%, even more, 1/10 of 1%, it's just fine. They're at the top of the richer than ever, more powerful than ever, controlling the political system, disregarding the public, and if it can continue, sure, why not? Just what Smith and Ricardo warned about. So, for example, take, say, Citigroup, for decades, one of the most corrupt of the major kind of investment banking corporations, repeatedly bailed out by the taxpayer over and over again, starting in the early Reagan years. Now, once again, I won't run through the corruption, you probably know about it, but it's pretty astonishing. A couple of years ago, they came out with a brochure for investors. They urged investors to put their money in what they call the plutonomy index. They said the world is dividing into a plutonomy, the rich, those who buy luxury goods and so on, and that's where the action is. They said their plutonomy index is way outperforming the stock market, so put your money into it. And as for the rest, we set them adrift. We don't really care about them. We don't need them. They have to be around to provide a powerful state which will protect us and bail us out when we get into trouble, but other than that, they essentially have no function. They're sometimes called these days the precariat, people who live a precarious existence at the periphery of society. It's not the periphery anymore. It's becoming a very substantial part of the society in the United States and indeed elsewhere. And this is considered a good thing. So, for example, Alan Greenspan, at the time when, little competition, when Alan Greenspan was still, St. Alan, hailed by the economics profession as one of the greatest economists of all time. This was before the crash that for which he was substantially responsible. He was testifying to Congress in the Clinton years, explaining the wonders of the great economy that he was supervising. And he said a lot of the success of this economy, he said, is based on substantially on what he called growing worker insecurity.
Can you announce if they need to stay off of the grassed, roped-in areas?
Please stay. Yeah, let's do it this way. Please stay off of the roped-in grass area over there. That's a very nicely done organic area, and we're trying to keep it clean.
You heard him, I guess. Greenspan testified that the very successful economy he was supervising, which has the properties I described, was based substantially on growing worker insecurity. If working people are insecure, if they're part of what we now call the precariat, living precarious existences, they're not going to make demands, they're not going to try to get wages, they won't get benefits, we can kick them out if we don't like them, and that's good for the health of the economy. That's what's called a healthy economy, technically. And he was very highly praised for this, greatly admired. Well, now the world is indeed splitting into a plutonomy and a precariat. Again, in the imagery of the Occupy movements, the 1% and the 99%, not literal numbers, but it's the right picture. And the plutonomy is where the action is. Well, it could continue like this. And if it does continue, this historic reversal that began in the 1970s could become irreversible. That's where we're heading. And the Occupy movements are, the first real major reaction, popular reaction, which could avert this. But as I said, it's going to be necessary to face the fact that it's a long, hard struggle. You don't win victories tomorrow. Have to go on, have to form structures that will be sustained, they'll go on through hard times, and can win major victories. Now, there are a lot of things that can be done. I mentioned before the...
You give me one of those mics, people can hear you better.
Sorry, just keep the...
You just keep that one up to your mouth, sweet.
Okay, I'll keep this. I mentioned before that in the 1930s, one of the most effective actions was sit-down strikes. And the reason is very simple. That's just a step before takeover of the industry. Well, through the 70s, as the decline was setting in, there were some very important events that took place. One was in the late 70s, 1977. U.S. Steel decided to close one of its major facilities, Youngstown, Ohio, and instead of just walking away, the workforce and the community decided to get together and buy it from U.S. Steel and hand it over to the workforce to run and turn it into a worker-owned, worker management facility. They didn't win, but with enough popular support, they could have won. And it was a partial victory. This is a topic that Edgar Alperovitz particularly has discussed in detail. It was a partial victory because even though they lost, it set off other efforts. And now throughout Ohio, and in fact in other places, there's a scattering, hundreds, maybe thousands of sometimes not so small worker-owned or at least partially worker-owned industries which could become worker-managed. And that's the basis for a real revolution. That's how it takes place. It's happening here too. Just in one of the suburbs of Boston about a year ago, something similar happened. A multinational decided to close down a profitable, functioning manufacturing facility. It was doing some high-tech manufacturing, not profitable enough for them. The workforce and the union offered to buy it and take it over and run it themselves. The multinational decided to close it down instead, probably for reasons of class consciousness. I don't think they want things like this to happen. If there had been enough popular support, if there'd been something like this movement and it could have gotten involved, they might have succeeded. And there are other things going on like that. In fact, some of them are major. So not long ago, Obama took over the auto industry. It's basically owned by the public. And there were a number of things that could have been done. One was what was done, reconstitute it so that it can be handed back to the ownership or very similar ownership and continue on its traditional path. The other possibility was to hand it over to the workforce, which owned it anyway, turn it into worker-owned, worker-managed, major industrial system that's a big part of the economy, and have it produce things that people need. And there's a lot that we need. We all know, or should know, that the U.S. is extremely backward globally in high-tech, in high-speed transportation. It's very serious. It not only affects people's lives, it affects the economy. It's a very serious business. Just had a personal story. I happened to be giving talks in France a couple months ago and ended up in southern France and had to take a train from Avignon, southern France, but to the de Gaulle airport in Paris. It took 2 hours. It's the same distance as Washington to Boston. I don't know if you've taken that train, but it's about what it was, 60 years ago when my wife and I first took it. And it's a scandal, But it could be done. They had the capacity to do it, the skilled workforce. We've taken a little support, popular support, and that could have made a major change in the economy. Just to make it more surreal, that while this option was being avoided, the Obama administration was sending its transportation secretary to Spain to get contracts for developing high-speed rail for the United States, which could have been done right in the Rust Belt, which is being closed down. There's no economic reasons why this can't happen. These are class reasons and reflect the lack of popular political mobilization. Well, things like this continue. We have... Okay.
Trying to get you to stop feedback.
Oh, I see.
Get away from that speaker.
You can see why I'm not a public speaker. This doesn't...
Everybody to hear you.
Okay. Well, I'll just...
So if you hold the mic straight like this, the projection will pick up.
Like that?
That's it.
A little late, but, well, I think I've probably talked enough anyway, so let me just say that I'd like to make more sense to turn this over to public discussion, but I've kept to domestic issues, and these are by no means the only ones. You all know that. There's very dangerous developments in the international arena, including 2 of them, which are kind of a shadow that hangs over almost everything we discuss. There are, for the first time in human history, real threats to decent survival of the species. There are 2. One has been hanging around since 1945, and it's kind of a miracle we've escaped it. That's the threat of nuclear war, nuclear weapons. And though it isn't being much discussed, that threat is in fact being escalated by policies of this administration and its allies. And that something has to be done about that, or we're in real trouble. The other, of course, is environmental catastrophe. The world is, practically every country in the world is taking at least halting steps towards trying to do something about it. The U.S. is also taking steps, namely to accelerate the threat. The U.S. is the only country, major country, that's not only not doing something constructive, but so it's not climbing on the train, it's pulling it backwards. Congress right now is dismantling legislation instituted by the Nixon administration, really the last liberal president of the United States, literally. And that shows you what's been going on. They're dismantling the limited measures of the Nixon administration to try to do something about what's a growing, emerging catastrophe. And this is connected with a huge propaganda system, perfectly openly declared by the business world, to try to convince people that it's all just a liberal hoax. Why pay attention to these scientists? And we're really regressing back to the medieval period. It's not a joke. Now, if that's happening in the most powerful, richest country in history, this catastrophe isn't going to be averted. And everything else we're talking about won't matter in a generation or two. Well, all that's going on right now. Something has to be done about it very soon, in a dedicated, sustained way. It's not going to be easy to proceed. There are going to be barriers, difficulties, hardships, failures. It's inevitable. But unless the process that's taking place here, elsewhere in the country and around the world, unless that continues to grow and becomes kind of a major force in the social and political world, the chances for a decent future are not very high.